Hello, welcome to the Josh Volinski Show. Today, one of my very, very favorite people are here, Harold Hudson Channer. I like to say he's the Dean of Public Access Producers. Whether that's true or not, he comes damn close to that title. But working with him as a technical director, there have been some very, very pertinent questions that have crossed my mind, and I want to discuss them with him. Because first of all, not only do I like what he says and what he believes and how he interacts a lot with people, and I know he loves human beings, but I really want him to accomplish what he says he is about. So the first question I want to ask him, which is very important, is, Harold, you have said many times that we public access people can change the world. What do you mean by that?
Well, that's a large question, isn't it? It really is. I think it has to do with communication, and I really like the model of public access because of, well, for a lot of different reasons. And I think there's a thing stirring in the world where the people who usually have not had very much influence in terms of what you see on television or now computer screens and so forth to say, and it's very democratic, and I think that that sense of democracy is going to be important in terms of new ideas emerging out of the normal way people see society. And I think world society is on the verge of a qualitative moment of transformation out of a long history of our existence on this planet. And I think it's, we did a program with Isaac Asimov a little while ago, and he said that this is the defining generation. We are in our maturity, the young coming up, but this is the defining generation in terms of the evolution of, well, consciousness on the planet, and we're at a time of a qualitative transformation, one side of which could be realization. We have to get good documentation for it, but the weapons are now species lethal since about 1970. There's modeling for that. That's something, a new existential reality in universe having to do with the effects of the extension of our mental and physical capability through technology into the environment. The weapons have finally become to where if they're unleashed, it would be the end of the entire human species. On the other side, the technology is liberating in its potential and its capability of the whole of the human society within an appropriate ecological context that could lead to a transformation of the human condition within the larger ecological order that would be qualitatively transformative. That is, liberation after 200,000 years of our existence may be available to us at the level of capability that's equally existentially significant to the evolution of affairs. And so that is where the voices for that new way of understanding things and the achievement of a liberated order where everyone can realize their own inner given potentiality rather than being subjected to oppressive institutional assumptions and so forth is at hand. That in turn could lead to what would be seen from a strictly materialistic understanding of events in universe to a liberation of the human condition that would result in a resonancy that would interaccommodate us to universe at a level transcendent to where we have been throughout the 200,000 year tenure of mankind on Earth. It's comparable to, like in evolution, what they call punctuated equilibrium, where there's a long period of a steady state, and then there's a quickening, and then there's a punctuated equilibrium, the new appears, the evolution of new species, a new relationship to the universe, which might be able to be the promise of the time in which we live. the means for understanding that intellectually and also in practical terms of implementation are now, because of the exponential increasing capability that the technology is offering. And so it's not unlikely that we live in a time where we will be able to, we use the term easily, change the world for justice. One last little thing on this little tirade is my favorite line is James Joyce saying, history is a nightmare of injustice, or that we're attempting to awaken from. That moment may be here, and to realize that is the big challenge confronting mankind, and I think it's likely to come out of the people, and it's likely to come out of institutions like public access television, which is a democratic ability for there to be multimedia communication and access to the store of human knowledge that will give us the wisdom and the understanding that makes it possible to realize that liberating transformation rather than annihilating the hominoid line on this planet in this particular universe.
Yeah, I hear you what you're saying, and I understand that you're speaking in the broader sense. But what troubles me is where the average person on the planet is. So even though here at Public Access we have YouTube, and we have Facebook, and we have Twitter, and we have the internet, and all of that backup and so on, still, when you approach the average man and woman and child on the street, you become a bit troubled by the fact that that's not what they're looking at. They're looking at some of the hit music and the latest movies and the New York Post and so on. And even so many enlightened people who I love and know and who we respect tell me that they cannot afford the providers, like whoever the providers are of cable television and so on. Yeah. So how do we get around that particular dilemma and problem?
Well, that's an important question. I can remember when I was up in New Paltz. I used to teach at the State University at New Paltz back in the 60s and 70s. I happen to think 1970 is a major year in transformation, but they had a cable system there. It was, I think it was $5 a month, so it was available to everybody, and it's gone up, and there's an awful lot of cost that's been added to it. It's $100 or more to get it for the various services, but there's that question, and that's part of a larger question that the technology and the economic system which is in place is not adequate in terms of distributing demand. We would call it in economic theorizing adequate demand or money to the people in terms of the way the society is organized. And one would want to have a system where people are able to be comfortably leisured in their own consciousness and able to do what it is they want to do rather than what they have to do in order to earn the right to have some bread to eat. We're like wage slaves is a term the Marxists would use, and is really appropriate because the capital assets are increasingly and exponentially so responsible for the actual production. And the production is all, the capital assets are all owned here, as everywhere, in a tiny plutocratic class that is becoming overwhelmingly wealthy. And the idea that the only way to distribute income to the people, the masses of the people, is through their job or through their labor participation in production. It's an outdated idea, because the trend is for the technology to do ever more of the production, and we're going to have an alternative way of distributing income to them. That the cable industry agreed in 1970 to not retain all earnings in terms of what their activity was a breakthrough. It was in part of that period of 1970 when the Woodstock Festival and the Vietnam, and you'll remember it because we were grown at that time. And that was a major point of transformation existentially that was going on. And they had a major transformation occurring then. But it's just that the economic potential, the cable industry was born then also. And Muammar Gaddafi was born then, in that time frame, for whatever it's worth. I've been following that very much on this day because there's so much going on in Libya, which I'm very interested in.
Yeah.
But in any case, the cable industry agreed, rather than retaining all earnings, and just a quick lesson, you have two things largely, Josh. You have a private sector, corporate, profit, and you have public sector, government. They can tax and spend, and they can regulate, and so forth. And that's largely the way in which the society and the news is reported, the dialectic between those two. We have Republicans, Democrats, all that, and the news is reported that way. But in that period of 1970, there was input from civil society because there was a civil rights, Malcolm X, all of that. There was a stirring that was coming, and the cable industry agreed. They could see they were going to make a lot of money because they're going to lay a cable that brings programming and data into the home and institution, and they were going to make a lot of money, and they have. But they set aside 5% of their net of tax earnings for payback to the people for governmental, educational, and public access. And so we get about 1% of that. And that's a model by a private sector entity, the cable industry. They've agreed to that. And so that makes it possible for there to be a facility such as this. This is a very good facility. You had capital costs involved. I don't know, you got 45, 50 people on staff. There's operating costs. And that comes from the cable industry. And that's from a private sector entity. And it comes, and the financing of this place that makes it possible institutionally to be solid is coming from the cable industry. And so that's to be applauded that they followed through on that on a 10-year franchising agreement that's made possible 3,000 of these places across the country where the costs that are involved in the production of multimedia, even onto Final Cut Pro editing and all the advantages that are coming now, are met so that the programming can be done without it being a business operation. It can be done by the people. The democratic expression of the people in multimedia can be done without being involved in money. It's free. Everything can be made free as it is, and that's a great thing in terms of the means by which communications can take place. The only other thing they support, and they all recognize, you got divisions within any organization of human beings between bean counters and visionaries, and there are people who, Ted Turner, Brian Lamb, and so forth, are visionaries, but the bean counters who are thinking in terms of short term, the only other thing they support like that, and they're very proud of, is C-SPAN. And among all the 1,936 channels there are on Time Warner or on cable, the one that perhaps are most relevant are the C-SPAN channels that bring book TV and intellectual discussion and congressional hearings. And they are very proud of that all. I think it would be very advantageous if the people within the cable industry, the large companies, Time Warner and so forth, realized that they could get a great deal of public relations value by claiming, as they do to C-SPAN, they relate to it as the jewel in their crown, as the saying goes. They could do the same to public access and give fulsome support to this democratically oriented system, coming with support from the private sector is an interesting wrinkle on it, but for multimedia programming, which the whole world is galloping toward. So in that sense, I don't know how to get over that conundrum. It does cost a lot. It's a problem of income distribution. And one last little caveat is Lord Keynes argued in a letter to his grandchildren in 1930 that you're going to be confronted with something that's very hard to understand, and that's technologically induced unemployment. And I see we got the figure down to 9.8, or no, we got it below that now.
Wow.
So there's that, but the employment model is a way of distributing buying power to the mass of the people is out of date with what the future requires. So we have to have an alternative way of forming capital and distributing income in a way that ownership of capital instruments could be a way in which you distribute buying power when the technology is able to displace massively labor input to production, which is the trend of history, particularly in the United States, but the trend of the world. So that's a large issue of economics, but it's a little hard to get your mind around, but something along those lines.
Yeah.
That's why I support public access.
I get very upset when when I see people reading the New York Times. Sometimes there's even difficulty with the Times, but here is the thing, they are involved with emotional simplification and misinformation. And when you look at them, and even the most of the corporate media, it is very, very difficult to understand really what has happened in Libya. Now, you mentioned earlier, you touched upon Gaddafi. Now, originally, I understand, I listened to you, originally Gaddafi articulated and expressed some very good ideas. What were those ideas, and was he able to facilitate them?
Well, that's a second. There's two issues there involved. Yeah, and one, I just had a good talk with Drew upstairs trying to understand, because there's a thing going on in Libya now, and as you know, that's the only country I've been interested in for a long time, and because I think that what they were trying to do and have accomplished more than we're able to realize, actually. But a quick history, Libya was the poorest country in the world in 1969, right in the midst of that Woodstock era, when they made their revolution. They were literally the poorest country in the world. Literacy was practically zero, and so forth. And they made that revolution, and it was based largely on tribal identities. They had large tribal groupings. They had one in the east, Senussi, and that's Benghazi, where the most of the reaction's coming from. They had another Gaddafi in the west, Tripoli, and so forth. And there was another in the south part of the country. And a lot of the animosity is at a tribal level. It's a little hard to understand from our perspective, but that's something that ought to be said. But he made the revolution. It took a while for them to get their act in order after they made it was a no blood loss, no death or anything in the displacement of the king then. They'd been the first country to be admitted to the UN in 1951 out of that. But then they went ahead, and he was a thinker. He's thought of as the thinker. I've been there about 8 times. I'm very much like the country. And he said about, and it's a little hard to do in soundbite, but he said about looking at it, and it would be worthwhile noting that he was a champion in the minds of many. It might be people who are generally concerned with the least among us, the people who supported the civil rights movement, and that kind of thing, that he was widely supported by the people who did that. The struggles for African liberation, Nelson Mandela loved him, even when he was in Robben Island. Abdel Nasser did. They got along. Practically all of the American Indian nations who had been royally treated, every treaty broken by the Europeans with the American Indian peoples of the hemisphere, were in support of him. Hugo Chavez now is in support of him. Evo Morales is in support of him. Some of the support is coming in because he supported generally what would be seen, and generally the people who are concerned, in my thinking, there are intellectuals that are relevant on the right. I guess it's a little hard, but by and large, that left is mostly the intellectual community of the world is of the left. You can see it's there. It's a concern for the least among us, as the wisdom schools have informed us throughout the ages and so forth, is from the left. And the intellectual part, the right seems to be more in support of the power structure du jour that have all the wealth and power saving and so forth, by and large conserving the advantage of those who were in a position of favor in terms of history's pattern. And so that's the thing. And he was supported by the left. He set up a country. It was a little bit unusual. They finally set it up, and among other things, There were only 4 million now. They had a great deal of oil. They were like that discovered in the Sahara, and it's like Norway, a small population with a great deal of income. He seemed to have spread it around very well. And if you look at even the CIA statistics, they went from 0 practical literacy. There's now 92% literacy. Everybody has access to education. You go to the university, it looks like the University of Southern California. Women are much involved in it. They've gotten homes that they have ownership of. They've spread it around. They got electricity into every village. They've done this. They got 92% literacy now, the highest rate. They've got the highest standard of living in Africa. So these are accomplishments that he's done. But ideologically, and they set it up, they took a look at history, and he reads out, we did a program with him, it's available on YouTube if anybody wants to see it, but he set it up, and we looked at history, and he said we had monarchies, we had the dynastic states, our example is European, we had dynastic states coming out of 1,000 years after Rome, and that was thought of as historical legitimacy. That was historical legitimacy. Then came the Enlightenment. We came up by the Scottish Enlightenment, 1776. The steam engine was invented in 1776. Adam Smith wrote Wealth of Nations. It was a harbinger of the time to come, Industrial Revolution and so on. And then there was a revolution made in the United States of America. And the United States of America stood up to the assumed legitimacy of the dynastic orders, the royal families of Europe. And they thought of America as bumpkins across the ocean that didn't know, because people get ensconced within institutions that they're used to. So they would be saying, where are all the assize courts and the things that undergirded feudalism, because you were building something new. And so they were building all these new institutions and so forth. And so there was opposition to the American example, but the American example has been codified in our founding fathers, in our Constitution and so forth, and they've established themselves, British sea power, European sea power, colonization of the world and so forth. Then the United States emerged as a superpower after the Second World War, and they have a way of seeing the world. They have institutions they're committed to, notions of human nature, all kinds of things like that, and they assume that they are historically legitimate in terms of the way they organize the world. Most of the countries of the world, Soviet Union imploded, China has gone along with that, and Gaddafi stood up to it. And he said that there's something new needed. There are a lot of people think there's something new needed as we look at things in the year 2011. And what he did, he set it up to where they set up everywhere, in the name of democracy, he set up everywhere meeting halls. And we did a program in '91 with Mr. Gaddafi, and it was the age of Perot, and they were talking about town hall meetings. They wanted to have town hall meetings so they could get to the people, participate.
Can we see it on YouTube?
Yes, it's on YouTube.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful.
The description of it. But they set up everywhere meeting halls. Everybody over 18 years of age could go to the meeting. They could go to a place where they could participate. They got the agenda for how much income there is, international issues, national, down to whether there's going to be a traffic light or something. Like we had town hall meetings in New England. And it was formed, instead of a representative democracy where we vote for what Greg Palast calls the best Congress money can buy, that they have a meeting. So it's participatory democracy politically. And then secondly, economically, they had a section where they spread a great deal around through government. They called it socialist. And they did get ownership to people. They got education. They got health. They got a number of these things that were established, and they implemented as far as we could see. I went to a number of those meetings. People were talking. And so then economically, they have little signs everywhere. They have a private sector. They'll help you in the startup costs of that if you're going to do some sort of a new business, entrepreneurially or something. But they have one rule, and that is if you do set up, that's what they were trying to maintain. And they were trying to have sovereignty as much as possible at the level of the people's congresses, a participatory rather than a representative democracy, which is a big step in terms of the way in which the world wants to move, one would assume, in the name of progress or progressiveness. And then on the economic side, they set up a thing where you could start a business there. They'd help you up in that, but they had one rule they tried to have apply, and that was you could not hire anybody. They had little signs, partners, not wage earners, everywhere. And the implication was that you could start a business, but you couldn't hire anybody and distribute demand through labor. Okay? The people who made up the business had to be the owners of the capital assets of the business. They're not so against the, he wasn't a Marxist or anything, but they're not so against the idea of private government involvement and so forth, but they do have a private sector. But if you start a business, they had to own the assets of the business rather than be only workers. He used to say, those who are wage earners are slaves to those who hire them. Wage slavery, the people would call it. So they set up a system that resonates with a thing here in the United States, a small movement, but it's got legs, maybe, toward ESOP, where they formed capital in the United States by having ownership in the part of the employees or others, and they set that up. So they had a situation where the capital instruments are increasingly responsible for production. They should be owned by everybody, if only practically, so that you have a way of distributing demand or buying power to the people, which is now lacking because the capital assets here are all owned by a tiny plutocratic class around the world. So he was in advance of the possibility of a qualitative, of a change in history, the same way the United States of America was ahead of feudalism. He was ahead of the international order. He took a lot of heat for that because he was standing up for the masses of the people.
Yes.
And so you've got a real mixed thing. You may have a civil war there, but it's worth paying attention to. And there's a lot coming in now on the internet and so forth of that. And one doesn't know. Lord Acton said power tends to corrupt. There must have been some corruption or something because there's a lot of opposition. But they may have a civil war there. But there's also going to be a lot of support for him because we had a war of 1812. The British tried to take us over, and they got fleets going there, so we ought to keep our eye on that country.
I would like to share one thing with the audience, because the purpose of this program is to learn and listen. And I had this delightful experience with Malcolm X in the 60s.
Did you? Yeah.
I passed the Hotel of Teresa, and Malcolm X was in front talking to some of his followers. And I stopped and listened.
Yes.
And a couple of the followers started saying, "There's a cracker here. There's a cracker listening to us." And that interrupted. I was the cracker.
Probably want a cracker.
Malcolm X said, "You know, the man is standing here listening to us quietly.
Right.
And when somebody stops and listens and is willing to learn, you don't harass them or bother them." So even though I never had a full conversation with Malcolm X, I just respect him greatly for that moment. And what I want to say about you is that when you listen carefully to what Harold Channer is trying to explain and articulate, you may not always get in a word or two, but you will learn you will get a lot of information, a lot of knowledge, and you'll realize that Harold Channer has an awful lot to share with everybody.
Well, maybe it's a lot of things that hit me very hard. We are a program today with the current ambassador. Mr. Gaddafi wants to replace him with Ali Traki, my dear friend, who was ambassador here.
Oh, yeah.
And everything. But now they're saying he's not legitimate. So it's a thing that's, I don't think he's going to go quietly. And I think he's probably going to get more support than you think. Our war troops are on the way there. There's a danger of a no-fly zone. There's a danger of a military occupation. There's a danger of imperialism, seizing of the assets of that country. And so it's an issue. There's more there about Mr. Gaddafi. What happened, the implementation of it seems to have had some effect. They had great effect as far as I could see, having been there and so forth, but that there's opposition, and the opposition that's sweeping the Arab world is partly having to do with the technology and so forth. But I think Libya is an example. At the level of idea, no matter what happens, at the level of idea, he was a very progressive person in terms of trying to be of help to the least advantaged among us, which our system is not geared to deal with. It's all geared to trying to to have the kiss the hem of the powerful, as is there's a temptation for that because there's much to be gained in that kind of a position. But our system is in trouble. Our system, international, the whole international order is in system because we don't have a vision that the future requires for a liberated humanity.
And you're
so used to it.
If you're a thinker in this society,
right.
Never mind what you are politically.
And the stakes are so high, they've never been so high, Josh. We live at a time of liberation. Liberation is at hand, this generation, now, in a way that 200,000 years has not been the case. And the stakes are so high, the weapons are species lethal now. We can't just keep playing the realpolitik like we did even in the Second World War. The stakes are so high, so understanding things in a nuanced way, in a full kind of way, is important. I think public access is a major place that can take, can become available. And now we got the wondrous ability, this is streamed to the internet all over the world, it can be seen everywhere, those kind of things. But you got people who are very susceptible to special interest propaganda and that sort of thing. You always have to guard against that by the powerful, who can manipulate the weak, the masses. And so all of those things are at play now. So it's a very, very interesting and very challenging and very disquieting time because the stakes are so very, very high.
And somebody like Mr. Walker in Wisconsin, I call him public access, AXIS, his tendencies are fascist.
They're coming into conflict now. They would like to do away with anything that serves the interests, as it's seen, of the masses of the people. Social Security they would attack, all of the things that were done by New Deal. They would like to get back, they don't want to have collective bargaining on the part of private sector or public sector employees. The work ethic is very important to our mythos of everything. And so they have to have an alternative way of distributing income so people will be comfortably leisured. The possibility of comfortable leisure where they could do what they want to do rather than what they must do by some senior vice president in some organization is a thing of a liberated way of being, comfortably even, onto comfortable. And then you're going to need venues for the expression of the free human spirit. And I think public access as an institution is a major one of those venues, along with community theater and a lot of other things, by liberating people doing what they want to do to fill their sense of purpose and universe.
Harold, I worked 65 years, and I can tell you there are some exceptions when it comes to merit increases, but very few. Usually, merit increases is pure fiction, so it's no wonder that the unions are very dependent on sonority. It's very important, sonority.
Yeah.
So it's true, like a nurse, an RN told me, registered nurse, yes, I work on a night shift, and so does go into the closet, and he goes to sleep all night. That's true. But they're not going to give me my increase because I work myself to death and he sleeps in a closet. Whoa. So I would rather him sleep in a closet and I get my increases.
Well, that's the thing. We're coming out of one phase into another because the promise, equally existentially significant as the destructive capability of war making and power manipulation, is liberation. So it's hard for people to realize that they're not going to have to endlessly be concerned with doing what a small group of people set templates for all the institutions that they must live up to in order to have a chance to feed their children. There's going to be a liberation, and when you do, you've got a liberated potential where there can be real human communication that isn't power playing with each other.
Anyway, I want to thank
Okay, yeah.
Harold Hudson.
Oh, I want to
Potter.
thank Josh Volinski for all his great
It's been
good work.
wonderful.
Yeah.
Everyone. Thank you very much, and we will see you next time, whenever that is.
Whenever that
And
is.
if we run over, it'll be on YouTube.
Yeah, we can put it on YouTube.
Maybe
yeah.
probably, as
Yeah.
we're going, probably Facebook and Twitter too.
Well, it's not Twitter, it's Twitter, I think.
Twitter.
You tweet, but you must
well,
Twitter. It's the generic
yeah,
term, I think.
I'm
is
not
Twitter. I don't know how to make
articulating
it
right.
work, but
Yeah.
we'll learn. We're
Yeah,
catching
we'll
up.
learn.
We need some 7-year-olds to give us some direction. The good books is the children's
I
show.
don't know how to pronounce it. You don't know how to make it work.
Well, between us, we got ourselves a good accommodation, yeah. Okay, well, it's good to talk to you, Josh, always. A whole bunch of stuff going on.
Thank
Love you,
Harold.
brother.
Thank
Love
you.
you. Thank you for
It's
that.
a great show.
So, we're just talking about it's a really incredible time.
Paula said she'll put it up, provided we help her more.
No.
She has some ideas how we can help her more.
Okay, whatever. We'll help everybody. Everybody's helping. It's a great place. I've been in. It's just great. Yeah, well, she helps us too. And she's doing great work. She and Joe Barden and all that.
She goes further down the rabbit hole.
I don't like going further down anything because I like systems. I like a little bit of systems thinking where you're in touch with the broad. Go out and include more things rather than one fixed view. There's too much specialization in my
There's some
view.
truth in that.
Yeah.
You go too far down the rabbit hole.
In academia,
you end up like Alice in Wonderland.
Well, no, yes, well, maybe, but also academia got very, you can divide and conquer like they did in colonial days with the, but you can divide and conquer the intellectual community. And if you get everybody all streamed out on one thing that they know a great deal about and call it scholarship, that's like dividing and conquering, making, innocuous the intellectuals thing in terms of systems understanding that is called for by people who can think about things in a systems way,
Yeah, she
which
likes
is what
it
we
very
really
much.
need.
She keeps running it.
Who?
Paula, she likes it very much.
Oh, are we done now?
She's going to be on YouTube.
Oh, okay. Oh, I'm sorry. You should have just did so. We could have stopped talking. Just go on endlessly. Okay.
You have to also have Laura in here.
What door?
Oh, she's a really Lieutenant Laura.
Are you done now? You're going to do
She
another
even
show?
knows about your
Are you
stuff.
doing another show?
No, I'm
Oh,
finished.
we have to strike the
I
set.
think
then.
I've been doing it till 9 o'clock. I mean, since 12 o'clock.
Boy, long day, huh?
Well, Paula had a wonderful show with Carmen,
Hello.
Hey,
Who are you?
Adina.
and I wish we had more.
Adina. Healing is appealing.
Pardon?
Healing is appealing is my show.
Oh, healing is, oh, you're a
I'm more
producer.
new on the scene.
Oh, welcome aboard, dear.